Hello, I'm Matt Galloway, and this is the Current Podcast. It was a seemingly coordinated attack. Hundreds of handheld pagers used by the Iranian-backed militant group Hezbollah blew up across Lebanon yesterday, all at the same time. The explosions injured nearly 3,000 people and killed at least 12, including 2 children, overwhelming the country's fragile healthcare system. Lebanon's information minister condemned the detonation of the pagers as Israeli aggression. William Christou is a journalist based in Beirut. Just a warning to our listeners, some of the details of what he tells us may be disturbing. William, hello.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. How did this unfold yesterday, this explosion, as I said, seemingly coordinated of all of these different pagers across the country?
Sure. So around 3:30 yesterday, reports started to trickle in that there was a security incident, first in Beirut, then in the southern city of Sur, and then it was clear that it was all over. At first, nobody knew what to make of it. People were throwing their cell phones away, with a rumor spreading that cell phones were blowing up. Soon, it became clear that the pagers, commonly used by members of Hezbollah, were exploding. And it very quickly became apparent that this was not your typical attack. We've become used to airstrikes and drone strikes and shelling over the last 11 months of war. But even so, the number of sirens and ambulances that we heard, made it quickly apparent that this was not your ordinary incident. And the Lebanon's public health ministry asked all of its employees to head to hospitals regardless of whether or not they're on duty. And they asked citizens to stay off the streets so that ambulances could reach hospitals.
There is some CCTV footage that has been circulating of these explosions and what they looked like. Some of it's pretty disturbing to watch. But in general terms, can you describe some of the scenes as these pagers blew up?
The videos are pretty shocking. In one, you see a man who's shopping and women next to him, they're buying vegetables when all of a sudden an explosion happens at his hip. People run away and he grabs his hip on the floor screaming. And we see all sorts of videos similar to this where people are going about their business when all of a sudden there's an explosion. It was very confusing at first because it happened all over Lebanon simultaneously, and no one was sure what the cause was. I spoke to people yesterday, and they told me they thought at first it might be a terrorist attack, having experience with that in Lebanon. In the end, it turns out that it seems to be some sort of sophisticated, coordinated cyber attack.
Who seems to have been targeted by this?
So the details of this, they're still being uncovered. The country's hospitals and administrations are overwhelmed. But pagers, they're not used by most people these days. They're used by members of Hezbollah, and it seems that they've adopted the technology as sort of a low-tech solution for a high-tech problem. Israel has been very successful in hacking phones and surveilling where members are. A number of Hezbollah commanders have been killed over the last 7 months, and it's suspected that they had been hacking cell phones. So it seems that Hezbollah had used these pagers as a way of evading those hacking attempts.
The reporting in the New York Times and elsewhere has suggested that small amounts of explosives were implanted in the pagers that, as you mentioned, Hezbollah had ordered from a Taiwanese company, that they were intercepted, the explosive was planted, and then the pagers were distributed amongst the population, and they went off. Is that what you're hearing? Have you heard anything else about how something like this could have happened?
Yeah, it seems that seems to be a dominant narrative now. Hezbollah had ordered a new batch of pagers. They came from this Taiwanese company. Now, what the Taiwanese company is saying that on the way they stopped in Hungary. And seemingly that's where the explosives might have been planted. It was a small explosive planted next to the battery, and it could be remotely detonated by sending a specific message to the pagers.
At least 12 people have been killed, 2 children, as far as we understand it. You went to one of the hospitals that were treating the injured yesterday. And as you said, everybody who works in healthcare was called in to try to address the situation. What did you see there?
Yeah, it was a pretty grim scene. I went around 8:30, so we're talking about 5 hours after the attack happened, and I stayed for 2 hours. It was just a constant stream of ambulances coming from as far south as the the Lebanese border and from other hospitals in Beirut that were already full. You had over 100 families waiting, unable to check on their loved ones, for fear of overcrowding the operating room. All of them sad, angry. I tried to interview a few of them. Most wouldn't talk, saying they don't know who to trust anymore. So there's a real feeling of fear and paranoia here in Lebanon.
How fragile is that healthcare system? I mean, when something like this happens, does it at all have the capacity to deal with the scale of this and the number of injuries that would be coming in?
So Lebanon has been in an economic crisis for the past 5 years, and that's crippled its healthcare sector. You've seen massive brain drain of people, of doctors and medical staff going to Dubai, for example. But thankfully, the healthcare sector has been preparing for this for the past 11 months. They've been preparing for a war situation, for this exact scenario. I spoke to one of the nurses who heads their response unit, coordinating all across the healthcare sector in Lebanon. And she told me that healthcare workers had been spending the last 11 months looking at Gaza, watching footage coming out of the news, looking at the types of injuries that were there, looking at triage procedures, looking at the types of ways, the obstacles in the hospitals to prepare for an event just like this. So while some of the doctors I spoke to today were telling me it was a horrific scene, they seem to have been able to treat all the patients.
Many people around the world, whether it's international officials speaking on background or the reporting, is suggesting that Israel was responsible for this. Hezbollah called this Israeli aggression. What's the reaction in terms of what people there, where you are expecting in terms of some sort of response?
I think people are very angry here in Lebanon. Lebanon's quite a divided country, so opinions differ. But I think people are also fearful of descending into a cycle of violence. Some people I spoke to last night told me that they didn't want Hezbollah to respond, that they wanted to end the cycle of violence here. Others told me quite plainly that this event had forced them to pick a side in a war that they weren't necessarily comfortable being a part of before. And Hezbollah is the one fighting Israel, and they feel they side with them. Now, in terms of what Hezbollah's response might look like, we can look towards the past 11 months to get an idea of that. Typically, they target military and state infrastructure in Israel. When Israel targeted Beirut to assassinate the former military chief of staff for Hezbollah back in July, Hezbollah responded by hitting military bases in Israel. It's likely, given the unprecedented nature of this attack, that their response could encompass bigger parts of Israel, whether that be Tel Aviv or other parts of central Israel.
I just wonder how worried people are there. You're in Beirut, how worried people are about the prospect, 11 months in, of a much wider war.
I think people are still in shock. I think, that the sense of security and has been shattered, and many of them are grieving people who have been injured or even killed, and they haven't yet started to think about sort of the regional repercussions. But I don't think that anyone wants to see further violence. Now, whether that means they don't want Hezbollah to respond, I don't know. There's definitely anger here, and a sense of a deep sense that they've been wronged.
William, we'll leave it there. Glad to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
William Christou is a journalist based in Beirut. Besma Momani is a professor of political science at the University of Waterloo, senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Besma, hello to you.
Hello.
What do you make of this attack? There is, in the reporting of it, sophistication that is being described in terms of these pagers beeping. Ostensibly, there was a message from the leadership of Hezbollah. People pull the pager out of the pocket, and then it explodes. What do you make of that?
Well, I think initially when we all thought it was some sort of cyber attack, and so it was a software issue, I think we were all kind of marveled at the technical capability of the Israelis, because this would be quite different. No one really thought that it was sort of possible, although the Israelis have really used similar types of situation where using things like Pegasus spyware in phones to corrupt phones. Some great work done at U of T actually by the Citizen Lab on some of the activities where many countries in the world are using this to really compromise mobile phones, sometimes through WhatsApp. But it's not a cyber attack, which I think is a bit of a relief because that would have opened up a new gateway of conversation about what's in the realm of possible. This was more of a supply chain compromise, and that's a bit different. So the Israelis, again, presumably it's the Israelis, put some sort of explosive material inside with an electronic circuit, which again is still very dangerous, but it brings a broader question about, how safe are digital goods in an international supply chain where, again, as your previous guest noted, this is a Taiwanese product, but it looks like it might have been even manufactured in Hungary, which I'll point out is a very close ally, the government there, to the Netanyahu government. So it also opens up new conversations about, one doesn't often look at these supply chains in a geopolitical lens. So again, it opens up a lot of new questions about, digital goods and their safety. Certainly, I think that's really the big takeaway.
Just to be clear, the Israeli Defense Force hasn't commented on whether it was responsible for the pager explosions, but you believe that Israel was behind this?
Well, we've seen some reporting even in the New York Times where American officials say that they are very confident that this was Israeli. But again, I don't think any analyst out there would disagree with that pretty much.
It's also interesting. Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, this morning was saying that the United States didn't know about these incidents. What does that tell you?
Well, I think that was based on an overwhelming, mostly political feeling in the region that the Americans are really not just kind of involved in the broader war, but they're kind of kept abreast in all of these activities that the Israelis undertake. And I don't think that's the case. I don't think the Americans were involved, partly because, in fact, what we do see is a lot of American involvement in trying to de-escalate the situation. They do not want this to expand into Lebanon in particular, because the Israelis, frankly, can't take on the war by themselves. They don't have the capability after an exhaustion of being involved in the war on Gaza, to hold on to a second front. So in many ways, the Americans fear that Netanyahu might pull them into a war into Lebanon. So they really do want to de-escalate this for their own kind of interest in staying out of it.
Aside from showing that something like this is possible, that you can do something like this, that you can insert explosives into pagers that are widespread and set them off remotely simultaneously, what does an attack like this accomplish? Is that the point in some ways, to show that the unexpected should be expected?
Somewhat. I think they've done that before. The Israeli capability on the technical front is really, really strong, particularly on the cyber attack. Again, this wasn't a cyber attack, but on that side, there is great capability. They are the most advanced in the region and certainly amongst the top in the world. I think in this particular case, it looks like it might have been a part of a broader plan that the Israelis were going to use in the event of an invasion, in the event of some sort of operation in Lebanon, and it was discovered. And so they decided to, rather than kind of waste the operation, to execute it. So in many ways, sadly, there was no strategic value. It was a tactical success for sure, but there was no strategic value in this particular operation other than to, sorry, as crude as this sounds, not to let it, be wasted in terms of already having been implanted. But just again, back to the point that they could put this into, thousands of pagers throughout the country, be able to interrupt a supply chain. We don't know if all of the pagers were in the hands of Hezbollah operatives only. I doubt it, because that would really require it being done almost in Lebanon. And we think it probably was done in transit outside of Lebanon. And so it was destined to Lebanon. So it could very well be in the hands of non-Hezbollah operatives, which again opens the fear factor. I think that's the really important point in what your previous guest noted, is there's a fear factor now that, wait a minute, could they have done this in other digital goods? That's the kind of conversation is happening on the ground, unfortunately, in Lebanon today.
And so at that point, what sort of retaliation do you expect to see in coming days from Hezbollah?
Well, we've been saying this for months now. I think anything is possible because, unfortunately, these kinds of attacks can really, lead to the unexpected. I don't know. I think none of us know really. In many ways, we've been hearing this argument that Hezbollah is restrained. And the only way to sort of get at that argument is because if we look at the number of attacks happening and strikes, quite literally, the Israelis have about 400 to 800 strikes per month into Lebanon, and the Hezbollah has about 150 almost consistently over the same time. Both have residents displaced. So we have 60,000 in northern Israel displaced and about 94,000 in southern Lebanon. So they're both paying a price for this continued tit for tat. But, it is true that Hezbollah, I think, overall does not want to enter into war, partly because the Lebanese people are absolutely fed up and have, as Christo noted, they're really at their wits' end economically, politically, socially. There's no desire for war from the Lebanese, and Hezbollah does have to factor that in.
But will there be a desire for some sort of response?
Certainly among Hezbollah, I think they will. I mean, remember their second in command was killed in Beirut not too long ago, presumably by the Israelis. We saw a similar, assassination against Hamas's leader, Haniya in Tehran. I mean, there is a feeling in this so-called axis of resistance that, some sort of response needs to be made because the Israelis will just keep going and no one is willing to stop them. So in some way, I think they will be pushed. These were mid-level people, so they were not senior leaders in Hezbollah. But nevertheless, I think that fear factor inside the country might just indeed push Hezbollah into wanting to, again, create some sort of big show to prevent the Israelis from escalating.
It just feels in the midst of, as you said, perhaps diplomatic negotiations to try and reduce tensions, it feels like there is an inevitable slow step towards something larger. And I just wonder how what we saw yesterday adds to that, or is there a way in the face of that for people to see a cliff face and back away from it?
Well, I'd like to be optimistic that way, but I think what I would point listeners to is really what's happening inside the Israeli cabinet. So Netanyahu currently, who I think really for political reasons and his own personal political reasons, wants war to continue, whether it's war on Palestinians in Gaza or in Lebanon, dare I say, because it really is the only way he stays in power. He has got many, many corruption charges against him. There's a reason why many people are out in the streets wanting Netanyahu to go and to sign a ceasefire, but he simply does not see his own political viability if there's a ceasefire. And so this is the part that really, I think, deserves our attention.
There's reporting that he is considering firing his defense minister.
Exactly. And his defense minister, Gallant, wants to de-escalate with Lebanon. But the extremists, and I use that word very carefully, but the extremists in his cabinet want war with Lebanon. They see this as the opportune time. They've said some horrific things about Gaza, about quite literally ethnic cleansing of the population. But even in Lebanon, they're calling for more war. So you have this extremely hawkish and, again, partly extremist view inside Netanyahu's cabinet, and his personal political survival really depends on continuing war. And that is a really dangerous calculation.
And so we just have a minute left. In the face of that, who, if anybody, can turn the heat down?
Well, in many ways, that's why all eyes are on the Americans, right? Because they're the only ones who are the strongest ally of the Israelis and simply have all of the leverage, the carrots and sticks, including the fact that, $4 billion of weapons goes to the Israelis every year. And now we've seen even more so. So this is where I think many people do feel that Biden has failed. He simply does not want to exert any political power in really stopping the Israelis, particularly in pushing for that ceasefire. Even though, again, the rhetoric out there is that Biden wants ceasefire, but simply put, there's just no real carrots and sticks put because he's at the end of his term and wants to leave on his so-called high note of not pushing the Israelis too far.
Basma, good to talk to you as always. Thank you.
Thank you.
Basma Mamani is a professor of political science at the University of Waterloo, senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation.